Phil. Thanks. I'll have Cliff respond to that and invite people from the audience. We'll take questions from the floor now. So if you have a question, please go to the microphone. Cliff,
the 4 million babies times $1,000 each is not a calculation that has been lost on me. And indeed, I think that that's going to be one of the places that genetics really rolls out. We did a little homework there, and it turns out the average reimbursement for genetic tests from a state in the United States is $32 right now. So the $1,000 cost of a genome compared to the $32 reimbursement, obviously a big gap there. But I expect this to roll out like so many things in the genetic space in a voluntary opt-in way. You know, today 5% of all parents in the United States spend $1,700 on preserving cord blood from their infants, which is a purely voluntary thing. And you know, the American Pediatrics Association estimates that the probability of that cord blood actually helping that infant is 1 in 260,000. So this is a vanity purchase by wealthy Americans, Americans with incomes of over $100,000 a year. But it's an engine for starting this process, for providing the economic fuel to start sequencing newborns, tracking them, providing phenotypic to genotypic associations that will then convince the rest of the society that this is something we should do as a matter of public policy.
I just want to add a footnote to that great point. Newborn screening in the United States is controlled by a consortium of state governments. With all respect, there may be somebody in the room working for them, providing antiquated and substandard services at every level. It's ripe for a takeover by the private sector.
All right, questions from the floor. Please identify yourself as you ask a question.
Yes, this is Francisco de la Vega from Life Technologies. I want to bring the issue of false positives and false negatives into genome, personal genome. I think in terms of false negatives, you know, how complete a genomic sequence needs to be useful. For example, I wonder how many of these recently published sequences miss the must-have pharmacogenetic SNPs, for example, and whether that's going to be useful or not for clinical practice. The second, in terms of false positive, just before I leave the mic, is what we are going to do when we have false positives. And I'm not talking about false positives in terms of technology. Even the technology is perfect. What's going to happen when we screen hundreds of thousands of people and we'll find Mendelian mutations, not susceptibility mutations, with no manifestation at all?
Well, this is exactly what I'm talking about. The false positives, as I understand it, is not going to be such a technological problem in terms of what's called analytic validity. The false positives is going to be in terms of clinical validity. And you're exactly right that when people see that they are a carrier, or they actually have a Huntington mutation, or they have a BRCA mutation, then the question is, what do you say to them, and how does their life change, particularly if that starts to require surveillance that's going to be expensive, and so I think that's a huge issue. And just one, you know, I'm 3 months into the residency that Phil did some time ago, and the greatest surprises to me have been that geneticists don't like to order genetic testing, in part because of the cost. I had a gentleman yesterday who I wanted to order one genetic test for neurofibromatosis, and it cost $1,200. And partly because the 3 scariest letters in genetics are VUS, variant of unknown significance. When a sequence variation comes back, it may or may not represent a pathological mutation. What the hell do you do with it?
And whenever I speak about this publicly, clinicians say, I'm getting calls at 3 in the morning because, you know, people looked at a mole and thought it was strange. What's going to happen when they get a number? You know, there's going to be the worried well, and this false positive issue will certainly play into that.
And there's a downside, if I may just continue 1 second, there's a downside to the public health vision that I so admire that Dietrich has sketched out. And the downside is that the population becomes consumed with the possibility of low probability events and eats up resources with their healthcare system, something that Wiley Burke has called raiding the medical commons, in which they will go and get unnecessary tests, unnecessary consultations, unnecessary expense.
And Dietrich, I just wanted to go back to the universal newborn screening idea, because that's something you've spoken about. I know that's personally something that you're in favor of. I'm not sure that David Agus, your colleague, necessarily sees it the same way. But is that still something, is that an end goal for Navigenics, as you hope?
I think so. I think wrapping all of this DNA-based molecular diagnostic space up into a one-shot assay at birth and then across a person's lifespan in silico unmasking areas of the genome in an appropriate way, I think is certainly a cost-effective way to aggregate and focus all of this technology. But it'll be fundamentally disruptive to the biochemical testing companies, the one-off DNA testing companies, et cetera.
Next question.
Yes, hi, I'm Kyle Hart from Primary DX. We're a medical diagnostic company. You talked about, of course, the challenge of amassing more clinical knowledge so we can do something with the information you're providing. In a lot of cases, these are long-term things that you have to change your lifestyle, or maybe in the case when there's actually actionable things you can do, we're still stuck with the problem of reimbursement and growth through reimbursement in our healthcare system. I'd like you to maybe comment that in generally what policy changes you propose, and in particular, as a client of an HMO, I'm probably going to change my HMO over my lifetime, so they're not necessarily interested in my long-term care. And thank you.
Well, taking your second point first, every discussion I have with healthcare providers addresses the issue of how long an individual or a family stays within a system. And if there's a cost up front that isn't going to pay off for them later on from sort of a net present value point of view, they're not too interested. So selling new stuff into the system is not an easy thing. I agree with that very much. I think there's going to be a real challenge to find where areas, sort of primary cases, where you say, I can sell this information. I'll give you one. I'd like to change the standard of care for colonoscopy in the United States. I think DNA could do it today. Colonoscopy, $1,000 to $2,000 a person, recommends it for everybody at, say, age 50. Clearly, colon cancer is heavily loaded with genetic risk. You could take 20% of the population, to do all the DNA testing, take the 20% who are the most at risk, just do colonoscopy and them, move everyone else back 10 years. I'd get a lot of applause if I tell you you can wait on your next colonoscopy for 10 years. You're going to vote for me. And I think, and yet, without disclosing anything out of school, I used to be a consultant to Myriad Genetics. Their breast cancer test has done great. Their colon cancer risk test, which actually I think is an excellent test, barely sells compared to the breast cancer.